March 1988, and more than 3,000 civilians were killed when Iraqi warplanes dropped nerve gas on the town of Halabja.
The bodies which litter this town were those of people who ran out of their houses to try to escape the gas.
2 years later, and then President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, launched a surprise invasion of Kuwait. A huge military campaign led by the US forced him to back down. After the ceasefire, there were economic sanctions and UN inspectors appointed to oversee the destruction of chemical weapons. But Saddam Hussein didn't play along, and those inspectors soon left the country. Then there was 9/11. Within days, George W. Bush, then US President, had told his generals to plan for a possible war in Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
The White House repeatedly tried to connect Iraq to the 9/11 attacks, though those links later proved false. Bush then hosted Prime Minister Tony Blair in Texas. Blair's critics say it was at this point he secretly agreed to go to war. He denies that. Then President Bush went before the UN to make his case for disarming Iraq by force. The British government published its own dossier saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that could be ready in 45 minutes.
The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative.
The government later admitted that intelligence was faulty and the 45-minute claim was wrong. By November, weapons inspectors had been allowed back, but Saddam Hussein was thought to be stalling. After one last summit, an ultimatum was given.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
Good news, sir. Iraq seems to be cooperating fully with the UN inspectors. Looks like an all-out conflict can be avoided.
Oh, nuts!
Sir?
I want a war, I want a war, I want a war! All the other presidents have had wars.
Well, you've only just had a war, sir, and you didn't even finish that one.
Well, I'm gonna hold my breath until you let me have another one.
Oh, now, sir. Oh, I think I better fetch Professor Liebstrom.
Hello! Professor Liebstrom!
Yeah, I know. Instead of having a war, why don't we have an ice cream?
Yeah, an ice cream.
Yeah.
With chocolate sauce.
Oh, yeah.
And a war.
No. Sir, nobody else wants a war, except perhaps Britain.
Hey, let's have a war with Britain then.
Oh, Harry Moses!
It is something that can strengthen NATO, give us an additional string to our bow in circumstances where NATO doesn't want it.
I made the case, like I will do to all the leaders with whom I meet, that we need to think differently about the post-Cold War era, that there are new threats that face people who love freedom. They're the threat of an accidental launch of a missile. They're the threats of potential blackmail. When one of these nations develops weapons of mass destruction, they'll be willing to point at America, Britain, our allies, our friends, people with whom we've got commitments. And we've got to deal with those in a realistic way.
I'm prepared to say in principle now, you could back an American missile.
If you look at the weapons of mass destruction that people are trying to develop and nuclear proliferation, then it's important that we look at every single way we possibly can of dealing with this threat. Now, as the President said a moment or two ago, we don't have a specific proposal on the table yet. But I understand and share the American concerns, as I've said many times before. And I think what is important is that if we take this forward in a constructive way and have the right discussion with allies, then we can find a way through this. I've always believed that, incidentally, and I believe that even more firmly having talked to the President today.
I'd like to hear first your response and then the Prime Minister.
He assured me that NATO is going to be the primary way to keep the peace in Europe, and that the United States, and I assured him the United States will be actively engaged in NATO. remain engaged in Europe with our allies. But he also assured me that the European defense would no way undermine NATO.
Sovereign decision of each nation is necessary for speaking together as the founders of NATO. We would never do anything to undermine NATO. But where NATO as a whole chooses not to be engaged, it is important that we have the capability, where it's right and within these limited tasks that I've set out, to be able to act, should we choose to do so ourselves.
Voicing your displeasure.
It's difficult to foresee the exact circumstances in which I might pick up the phone and ask the President to help, but the fact that I know he is there and willing to do that is very important, because President Clinton was a great assistance during difficult parts of the Northern Ireland peace process, and it's a very difficult process.
More realistic. A change in sanctions should not in any way, shape, or form embolden Saddam Hussein. He has got to understand that we're going to watch him carefully. And if we catch him developing weapons of mass destruction, we'll take the appropriate action. See you at the gym.
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. I know this course of action has produced deep divisions of opinion in our country. But I know also the British people will now be united in sending our armed forces our thoughts and prayers. They are the finest in the world, and their families and all of Britain can have great pride in them. The threat to Britain today is not that of my father's generation. War between the big powers is unlikely, Europe is at peace, the Cold War already a memory. But this new world faces a new threat of disorder and chaos, born either of brutal states like Iraq, armed with weapons of mass destruction, or of extreme terrorist groups.
Big Ben tolled as the huge crowd marched to stop the countdown to war against Iraq. A seemingly endless current of marchers.
Oh, it was tremendous. I mean, I think it's one of the few demonstrations where people really thought they could stop a war, and therefore they felt them turning out individually as opposed to reading about it in the newspaper or saying, oh, that's a good thing, when they watched it on television.
As Mayor of London, I can officially welcome you here to this city in the biggest political demonstration in 2,000 years of British history.
It's hard to think of any one event that has brought so many different nations' protest movements together in that way. And I think it's just, people aren't stupid. That they could see that what George W. Bush was about wasn't human rights, it was about controlling the oil. And they didn't think that killing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East was worth that.
In Sydney, more than 200,000 demonstrators crammed into Hyde Park before bringing the city to a standstill.
The crowd here in New York City is quite larger than they had expected. We know right now that they are blocking off from 52nd Street all the way down to 72nd Street on First Avenue north of the United Nations.
Every faith, every age, every race. I have never seen anything that brought the diversity of British people together so much.
More than 1 million, say police, on the streets of the Eternal City.
America thought it was unstoppable after the collapse of the Soviet Union, what it did have was its own population, the British population, the population of all of its allies, were saying, you're not doing this in our name. We don't agree with this. We do not want this to happen, and we think that if you're reordering the world, you shouldn't be doing it by invading and bombing and occupying other people's countries.
From the left, the right, from the radical to the uncommitted, they came. Whatever the figures, without doubt, one of the largest gatherings, let alone protest rallies, in English history. It was the day the police simply banished the car from central London. Preparations from first light. In the frosty air, early morning political warm-up acts.
America's no stranger to big stacks of resolutions. Peace, not talking peace, 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 not talking peace.
Celebrity campaigners out of bed and out in force.
This is a historical day. This is going to be a great day to remember for people throughout the world.
I would very much like to be able to say to Tony Blair and George Bush that we elect you to actually represent us. We are the people. And you are ruled by us, and we say no to war.
This was the Northern March, already forming up hours before the noon start time. Thousands had had a pretty early start of it to get down here in time. Hundreds of coaches booked. Chartered trains from Manchester and across the country.
Even though United are playing, I think it's probably better to come to London because it's to try and stop the war.
Over at the Hyde Park rally, the rail union boss Bob Crow promised Tony Blair that if there is war, the Prime Minister ain't seen nothing yet.
And if war does break out, we should turn around and say that we're prepared to occupy our industries and not be prepared to allow for a war to take place anywhere throughout the world.
And this was the embankment, tens of thousands forming up on the second of the feeder marches. From the north, the south, the east and the west. From the left, the right, from the radical to the uncommitted, they came.
Birmingham.
London. From Bedford.
Cumbria. London. Slough Newington.
From Banbury. Wellingborough. Northamptonshire.
From Indonesia.
North Wales. Sheffield.
South London.
Birmingham.
Yeah, I come from Bristol, man.
Many say they'd never known an atmosphere quite like it. Could that be in part because so many were moved to protest for the first time?
I think the world's going mad. I just feel it's got to be stopped somewhere. Because after this, it'd be something else. It'd be another war after war. We've got to stop it.
Because I can see it escalating into something far wider that we just won't be able to stop.
The rally at Hyde Park was underway many hours before the feeder marches had even finished starting, so to speak. Tariq Ali's seen a demo or two in his time, but he told me he'd never ever seen anything like this.
Friends, we are here today to show Tony Blair and to tell him openly that if one country needs a regime change at the moment, it's Britain. In times of crisis, it is necessary to bring down a Prime Minister. Bring Blair down!
And so we're at Piccadilly Circus, where the two large marches fuse to become one even bigger one and head to the rally at Hyde Park. Well, we can argue forever about the validity of opinion polls, but what surely matters today is that this proposed war by Britain is historically unpopular. And the mother of all focus groups has descended on London to bring that fact home to Tony Blair today.
They just kept on coming. Noon and the police reckoned 150,000 were here. Mid-afternoon, it was 1/3 and counting. By late afternoon, the organisers certainly had a different view.
And our numbers now, we believe, are getting on towards 2 million people marching for peace in London today on this International Day of Demonstration Against War.
Whatever the figures, without doubt, one of the largest gatherings, let alone protest rallies, in English history.
We will lose this war. It will be a failure. All it will achieve is to be the best recruiting agent that the terrorists could hope for.
The United States is a monster out of control. Unless we challenge it with absolute determination, American barbarism will destroy the world.
And since we're discussing religion, from early morning it was clear that Muslim groups would this time be playing a large part in proceedings.
Well, the first message is that this is a great alliance, a great coalition between the Muslims and the non-Muslims who agree on the basic values of humanity, of saving mankind from catastrophe.
Some minor argy-bargy outside the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square, where else? But the leader of the 4,500 police on duty said this affair would be peaceful, and pretty much it was.
It's very easy to just sit at home and do nothing, and I thought, no, I'll do something to show my position, really.
I'm a Quaker, and we have a peace testament, and war not at any price.
We're just trying to show that the popular misconception that Americans are pro-war is false.
As ever, some just had their own agenda, but it was left to the only party political leader on the platform to suggest that Parliament perhaps should have some say if we're going to war.
The House of Commons should be given the right, which so far it has been denied, the right of a vote on whether we believe our forces should be sent into battle in that way.
Tonight, some protesters are mounting a sit-in in Piccadilly, but for most it's a tired and perhaps a long journey home. If you thought the Countryside Alliance March was big, think again. And all this just when we were persuading ourselves perhaps that we're becoming more selfish and are bored with politics. Well, politics has rarely seemed so interesting to many, and Tony Blair has never appeared so isolated since he took the office of Prime Minister. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Central London.